What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the game on Pax8 Live, where we discuss all the cybersecurity shenanigans you need to be aware of for the past week. Continuing our bell curve series this week, and as always, we've got Matt, and let's roll straight into the action.
All right, as Dom said and queued up for us, this is the actual final part of our bell curve series. And if you remember back to the beginning of it, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch it. We talked about how Microsoft put out this bell curve of protection slide where they said 98% of protection can be obtained by doing these 5 things. They didn't say comma space well. And so a lot of the purpose of what Dom and I are trying to do is walk people through what does it mean to implement these things inside your organization? What are the considerations you should have? What are the things that are failures? And before we get into the meat of it in a very selfish fashion, I would like to call up a video and force you to watch one more video about my beard shaving endeavor first before we get started. So if you don't mind rolling that for me, I really appreciate it.
Myself, Carrie Richardson, my wife, and Matt Lee put this thing out into the world. And Carrie said, "Hey Matt, like you've got this beard, why don't you come on up to the barber and shave it off?" And Matt said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm quite partial to my beard. It's kind of my thing. Cybermattlee, beard banter. It's in my logo." Carrie said, "Well, what about for money? Would you take it off for money?" And he said, "No, it's not a monetary thing. I'm not interested in shaving for money." And she said the magic words, which is, "What about for charity?"
I am now working towards driving cybersecurity for the masses. I'm also, unfortunately, going to be losing my beard very soon.
I'm very concerned about Matt Lee's future with losing his beard.
He's going to compensate for the lack of beard with even more conversation, which terrifies me.
Matt Lee looks like a guy who just walked out of a mountain after trying to forge a battle axe that's going to kill a dragon.
My question is whether or not hair is going to magically appear everywhere else, specifically on the top of his head.
I'm not sure he's going to lose his superpowers, but he's going to look like 12. I think it's going to be shocking, the baby face that's underneath that beard.
How long have I been growing this beard? It's been about 5 months now, I think, total. And I've grown quite attached to it.
So I actually haven't been clean shaven since 2008. My daughter, who's 13, has never seen me without a beard.
This is by far the longest I've ever let it go.
I think the last time I was clean shaven was probably 15 years ago.
I one time lost a bet, and I had to shave down to only a mustache, and I looked ridiculous.
I have a fiance and she can't wait for this thing to go away, but it was good for a good cause, so she agreed to take one for the team.
She understands it's for a good cause, so she will bear with it. But every time I shave, there's always this look of disappointment. Like I'll see you in a couple of months when it's back.
Breaking news from the Pax8 Live newsroom: the anti-beard shave protesters are taking it to the streets. Despite the good vibes of raising cash for charitable causes, these chin garden enthusiasts are in living fear of the fallout of follicle follies. Please donate to the cause early and often, but be wary of facial hair fallout.
I'm not a ZZ Top fan, although I do get asked about that all the time.
I would prefer Van Halen over ZZ Top any day.
The two things that people always bring up are either ZZ Top or Duck Dynasty.
I am a ZZ Top fan, yes.
I definitely enjoy their amazing beards in general. I don't think I could ever get to that level.
Can you not be a fan of ZZ Top? I mean, if you're not, I just don't think you're very cultured, and you should really go check yourself.
A beard, you ask anyone on here, they're going to say, yeah, it's a beard. It's facial hair. It's not really a sacrifice, but it's reflective of that giving, putting others first mentality, which I think we could all learn from.
I picked the charities on purpose to be around cybersecurity and as much around diversity, in the sense that we do not solve this cybersecurity challenge with the pieces that we have on the board today.
Encouraging things like diversity and cybersecurity, I think, are really important. Cybersecurity is not just, it's different than a lot of other career fields. We need people that think differently about the problems, that are creative.
My charity is Hackers for Vets, which happens to be my charity.
The one that was the reason that I got involved was Hackers for Vets. So my father was in the Navy, retired Navy guy, so just kind of hit home for me.
With a young daughter myself, that already is pressing all the buttons on every piece of technology she can get, there's a very real possibility she'll enter this. I would like to have the same opportunities available to her that were made to me.
So I think, they did a great job in picking some very worthwhile charities, and honored to be able to assist in those.
Put others ahead of ourselves is something that I think the country could benefit from, especially in the turbulent environment that we live in today. Like it's a role model lesson, and I'm definitely trying to pay as much attention as I can to it.
Put yourself out there to be loyal to something else other than yourself, something bigger than you.
All right. So just where are we on this charity? We are at $85,010 raised so far for charity. If we get the next $4,990, I have a donor ready to come in and give the last 10. So we are essentially about to hit our goal, hopefully before everybody takes off their Halloween costumes for the weekend, and get this thing wrapped up to where we've served all of our charities. If you don't mind, Danielle, would you kick us over into the news, please?
Like vulnerability reviews today.
Yeah, for sure. One of the first things we're talking about, Dom, and you and I can chat about this, is Microsoft made an announcement yesterday about Raspberry Robin Worm, which, first off, kind of back to the fun that I saw pop up on LinkedIn of, like, at some point, do we just stop making up fancy fun names for every single different vulnerability so that it actually can have some nomenclatural meaning? But this worm is part of a larger ecosystem. Fair? Okay, they're fun, I suppose. Unless your name's Teapot, and then it's not as fun.
Well, then, yeah, that's just on his part. That's a poor choice.
But this does come into propagation via USB drives, propagation via systems that are vulnerable to that. And, I think we can kind of agree that this is a pretty big vulnerability in general, as from an attack surface perspective, both from poisoned USB drives or HID devices posing as USB drives. And I guess for everybody's definition, HID. Dom, go ahead, take a poke at HID.
Human interface device.
1 point Dom, 100%.
Also known as a keyboard.
They become a keyboard. Right. Yeah, they become a keyboard. And so the attack surface of USBs is still huge, but it is nice to see Microsoft coming out with this information and describing it and going on to describe that it's basically an auto run type of an attack that has been reimagined, right? So if you remember in the past, autorun.inf, autorun.inf was a file that was in the root of a drive.
I used to write a lot of those. Yeah.
I did too. Yeah, they're fun. And they were kind of manipulable, right? You could do all kinds of sorts of baddie type things from that auto run.
Just a config file, so you can tell it to do whatever you want it, right? You put any file in there and say, hey, for my user's convenience, when this gets plugged in, or when a disk gets inserted, if you ever worked with those, please run this thingy-mabobber. And Windows will be like, sure, got you.
Thank you.
No questions asked.
Yeah, and make it easy to see and pop up that cool little UI for your installer, all that fun stuff. This one does a very similar approach, but instead of the autorun.inf, which doesn't work ever since Windows 10, essentially by several iterations of Windows 10, you couldn't do auto runs in the same way. But this kind of redoes it because they have a link file, and that .lnk file ends up creating a command.exe file. And then that command.exe executes MSIExec as a methodology of downloading the further payload from the C squared. And so it's pretty smart in the way that it approaches it. And it's something where, what do we say about this then? How do you defend yourself against this challenge? Is there any maybe control that speaks towards what we do with USB drives, Dom? And don't quote the number. I'm not.
I see where you're going. Well, no, but here's the problem, because the control you're talking about handles mass storage, and this is not mass storage. Right, in a HID-based device, there is storage obviously, but it's essentially a buffer that's used for saying when this is plugged in, send these keystrokes, and sends them very fast. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Once you plug it in, you're done. And the only hypothetical way to prevent it is to say no plugging in keyboards, which is obviously not a viable thing.
Or limiting it to an HID number, right? Limiting it to a type of keyboard asserted as a Dell that is this type. Yeah, totally.
Right.
But the good news is actually in this case, this isn't an HID attack. This is a traditional storage attack. And since that is the case, you should be able to say, I don't let people just use random flash drives. It's a bad idea, right? And so it really does come down to having adequate control surface. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, secure sharing exists, right? Like the biggest reason I used to run into USB drives at least, and I'm sure your guys' customers out there are running into wackier reasons or creating reasons. But I was like, I got this file and I need to give it to Susie, and it's too big to email, so I'm going to put it on a flash drive. No, put it in SharePoint or OneDrive and send a share link. Right? It's 2022.
Yeah.
And or even if you got put it in the network drive if you need to, but like whatever you have, it doesn't have to be a flash drive. Right? It's very I hear a lot of reasons, and I have yet to find a recent valid reason for why we should just allow mass storage to be added to devices.
The only place I still see it prevalent, two places, would be medical, where they're receiving data from patients in a multitude of formats. And the second place that you see it is in manufacturing, right? A lot of manufacturers have drip feeding systems that drip feed from a flash drive. And there is a better answer, I think, to your point, though. I mean, you could get a centralized drip feed or centralized capability to do that over a serial hub or something like that would take it from the network share as opposed to from a flash drive. But, if I want to attack people, it is still probably one of the most viable methods is drop 6 or 7 flash drives in the parking lot and somebody's going to plug it in, right? Like
we were joking the other day about making fake security keys that are actually USB killers and short your motherboard, right? Like there's a number of things you can do with USB. And really it's also a user training thing. Don't plug in random USBs, right? Like that's and one of the things I was actually just reading, it was on Twitter, somebody was charging a device and they plugged it in their MacBook, and MacBook came up and said, would you like to load this bootloader that you just plugged in? And I was like, yeah, that's the issues. Everything ships. These studio lights we use, like this one, get it in frame. This has USB power, and it's the most ridiculous thing ever, right? So I have like a huge collection of spare USB power adapters so that I don't plug it into my I/O. So if it's USB powered and it doesn't have a reason, put it in a power adapter, right? They're like $7 on Amazon. Get a power adapter.
Yeah, 100%. Especially the cheaper the equipment you buy, right? Like it's being funded somehow in some cases. So yeah, very good. All right, let's pop over to this next article, Dom, and I want to get some of your thoughts on it. Let me pull it up on my screen for you here, sir. And we'll go over here. So this was a bit of a snafu, and I kind of want your opinion on it, Dom. This was written by Dark Reading about 4 or 5 days ago, and they said, hey, Microsoft 365 message encryption can leak sensitive info. Now, as you go in to read it a little more, it's really talking more about sensitive metadata that could be used to form patterns and do decryption in large states. And this is kind of another highlight of, if you look in this, they basically said, which the company acknowledged but said it wouldn't fix. And there's so many of these things over time that have been those Microsoft said it's operating as designed, or this company says it's operating as designed, when there are giant security vulnerabilities that come along with that, right? So what are your thoughts on at least the initial thought? I just wanted to start a dialogue kind of on this concept of operating as designed, and then specifically in the context of this particular kind of vulnerability to some extent.
I think it depends on what's operating as designed, right? This one isn't great, but like let's expand this out. Let's say you write a tool, maybe perhaps designed to manage secrets, and maybe perhaps it stores a password in a TOTP seed, and perhaps in one API call, it sends all that data out, right? It's not a separate API call so that you can create 2 log events. I don't like that at all. That's ridiculous, because now I don't know how often the TOTP seed was viewed versus the password, right? And you're sending a lot of sensitive data in one response. This one, let's kind of set the stage. This is not decryption, right? You're not accessing the content of the message. They're basically saying that the ECB or electronic code book mode of operation can expose certain structural information about messages, and it's absolutely a vulnerability and a weakness, right? When you think about encryption, nothing about the content of what you've encrypted should be discernible, right? And we've seen this in algorithms forever, right? That's how Alan Turing did what he did, was the messages the Germans
the word Heil Hitler,
we're of a certain format every single time. And
it ended in Heil Hitler, and they were able to use that as a trailing indicator of a fingerprint, which is similar to this conversation. Yeah.
And out of that, things like salting were born, right? Where it's like, oh, we need to randomize this somehow. So in this, what you're really getting is you're getting some general structure of the message, and they do a great job talking through the attack of saying you have to collect a lot of samples first of all, and if you're already collecting those samples, somebody's already compromised. Would be my argument. But
Fair.
if you do,
and you probably have the decryption keys. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly, right. If you compromise the recipient or the sender, it's somewhere in there, right? So it's an interesting one. Do I think it's? I mean, I would love to see it fixed, but I think this is probably something in ECB itself. So the daunting task of fixing it would be significant.
Rewriting changing it.
Yeah. So it's a tough one. It's a problem in our industry saying that's a feature. That's how it's designed to do what it does.
Yeah.
Or we can't SSO that because there's a secret or whatever. No, not naming products, but I know of one.
Yeah. We might not name them though.
Yeah. It's tough, right? It's tough to think about, and I'm reading this article over here to make sure I'm getting it right. It's tough to think about as Microsoft rewriting all of OME, which is a technology that's been around forever. I've been deploying it forever. But again, I want to stress to everyone, this is not decrypting the message. They would have to capture a significant amount of sample data, and they might start to get the fringes of the messages you send. It goes back to the whole pattern of, if you sign off, have a great day in every single email message, eventually that pattern could be discerned.
Yeah, and I do want to quickly call back to where this has bit us before, was the Janet Jackson video, right? There was the Janet Jackson music video that could destroy hard drives, and Microsoft said, well, yep, operating as designed. And I think it was finally issued a CVE or something just recently, like 18 years later or something. Like, it's so funny how that plays out. But
about that.
there's I'll try to get it in the link in the comments later, but there is there's a list of these type things that are out there. There's a curated GitHub list of these operating as designed by Microsofts that are fun to peruse through every now and again. But yeah, the Janet Jackson one was a great one. Well, Dom, I think we're getting to that point where it's probably time for us to get into the actual conversation around, the bell curve of risk. And so for anybody watching today, I'm going to go ahead and get to my YouTube and get that up so you can ask questions and things like that. So please put comments and questions in the YouTube channel. But Dom, I want to kick us off with this first question of patching. When we patched in the past, and I'll point this finger at myself, I would patch. I was only patching primary system operating patches, right? I probably wasn't doing third-party patching in the early days. And when I was patching, I didn't have a goal. I did a task of patching, right? And where the goal would be closing the vulnerability. And so talk a little bit about task versus goal orientation when it comes to patching. Like, how do you become goal oriented in what you're patching? Is there a check and balance system that should exist? Like, kind of dig into that for me a little bit, Dom.
So I'm going to segue for just a second. I was actually on Reddit earlier, and I saw this thread complaining about Windows updates, and those are always fun to read. So I dug in. And they were mad because in Windows 10 11, the updates are fairly monolithic as opposed to tiny updates like the old Windows 7 update catalog. And then there was the argument about, well, Windows 7 updates sucked, which I agree. But anyways, if we dig into it, somebody said, well, this bigger patch is the better route to go, and you don't really need the security patches in between. So naturally, I kept reading. And their argument was, typically that patch comes out in time to close the 0 day before any exploits have been really publicized. So I want to set the record straight. That is factually incorrect.
That is factually incorrect.
Single 0 day.
Period.
Like, the reason the 0 day was found is because there is an exploit, right? And the second that comes out, there are GitHub resources typically that just exploit that in 2 commands. So I want to be super clear. Patch your stuff immediately, right? Like, do not wait for, if something comes out, every Patch Tuesday you should be patching, right? And if it's big enough, Microsoft's going to release a patch outside of Patch Tuesday. You need to deploy it. I saw that argument and I was like, man, that's not the right, that's wrong. So I want to set the record straight. There are exploits for every known 0 day that has been released publicly. You might not find them easily, but they are there. They're either on Onion or on GitHub, right? But anyways, going back to goal, right? The goal is twofold. From a security perspective, it's to patch against vulnerability, right? So you are patching for the purpose of preventing vulnerability. Those are the patches you're doing right now, right? All the time. as soon as they come out. We talked about this way back in proxy logon when questions came up about interrupting tax firms. You have to do it.
Yep.
It's a dangerous thing. The other side, your other goal is to maintain stability, which tends to be in conflict sometimes. Speaking of Windows updates, Microsoft, please hire a testing team again.
Brett, log on.
But you get into the situation of, and this is why I actually love Windows 10 and Windows 11 patching, is now I have these feature updates that I can defer, usually safely. Sometimes they sneak a bug in there, which annoys me, but typically a feature update and a security update are two different things, and I can defer that feature update. So I'd say you have two goals, but your primary one is you are patching because you're protecting from vulnerabilities.
Yeah. And I think what gets into this is that the patching systems being relied upon as the answer of whether I patched is often cause for failure. And what I mean by that is I could run a patch, it could complete successfully, but it could have failed to close the vulnerability. And so, CIS is pretty prescriptive about this. It's an entire control. It's Control 7. And it talks about patching your operating system, patching your third-party applications so they stay up to date. And then it talks about validation. Do a vulnerability scan to confirm the other half of it. And so when you think about that, my SchmabTech server, let's call it SchmabTech because we don't want to get in trouble. But my SchmabTech server would detect that my patches went through fine. And for the longest time, we were so happy that our patching was successful. We had such a high rate. Everyone knows there's been thousands of failures in the actual reporting end of that. So much that my clients would go check for updates, and they would have 140 updates sitting there, and they'd go, Matt, why do you guys suck so bad? Well, to me, my patching system was patching. It said so. It told me I was clean.
It was green, man.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was green. And I think that's the point, is you have to come up with these check and balance systems. Now, when Microsoft says that removing the bell curve of risk requires patching and quick patching and adequate patching across everything, it's because what I do as a threat actor is very easy. And to your point, if I see something about Log4j, there were probably 100 POCs within 4 hours of Log4j enumerability, attack surface, how it would work, different sets. There was a Unify 4j, there was a, right? And so you get all this rapid enumeration of capabilities that even a script kiddie like me can go and pull down and use and demonstrate for malicious purposes if I wanted. And I think that's part of this challenge is when you're talking about defensibility, it's probably one of the easiest ones for me to prove you weren't defensible if you aren't patching and validating your patching. Because it's one of those just basic functions of an MSP. I saw a lawsuit. I was trying to find the article, but I couldn't. But last year there was a lawsuit against where an airport, a municipal airport, was suing an MSP because they had been compromised, and the compromise was caused by not being patched, and they were supposed to be patching. And so you kind of get into this world where the need to patch. I feel like this young man or young lady next to you is very, very passionate about patching, Dom. I just feel like
yes.
Big
He's
patching,
over there
big
patching vulnerabilities right now. Yeah.
He doesn't mess around, man. Those Duplos go
No.
with Duplos, Legos go with Legos.
Yeah.
But the point is that when you have a vulnerability, for anybody that's not super cyber or doesn't understand technology very much, that's listening to this or watching this, you have this concept of, I write a code to do something, right? I write this program to fire up and run calculator. But what if I typed in 81047203 and then all of a sudden calculator gave me the ability to run a command shell that let me do whatever I wanted on your computer as an admin? Patching says, oh my God, we found this vulnerability. If you type in this number sequence, we get a prize, right? They get attack surface. Let's patch calculator so it no longer has that problem. So when you think about patching, it's really just, we found something that was unexpected behavior of something or an attack surface or a failure or a weakness. And now we need to fix that. To your point, though, it's usually found because someone is abusing it. It's usually found because there aren't healthy vulnerability systems out there. There aren't these things to get people to turn them in. And a lot of the financial gain goes towards turning them in as bad guys or using them for malicious purposes and divvying in. What's funny about the Microsoft article earlier is if you read on further, Microsoft actually paid him for this vulnerability and decided not to fix it. So in one swath, they both said, we do acknowledge this is a vulnerability and a weakness. Thank you. We'll pay you for that. But we're not going to do anything about it, right? So it's just an interesting juxtaposition in that regard. But, one of the things, you and I talk about this in class when we teach a cybersecurity class for CIS controls is there's an inverse challenge of starting to know more as well. Like if you patch and you get a green dot and it says you're good, you kind of at least have some stupidity to fall upon that you believed it was green and everything was in good faith.
Right.
When you start doing vulnerability scanning, what can people put themselves in a position of if they scan but don't have a plan to fix it, Dom?
Culpability, right? Like it's you are at, when from the moment you get your vulnerability report back, you are at more risk until you've built a plan and started addressing those problems.
Yeah, exactly. Because you knew about it. And now let's say I come
Right.
in and wreck someone's day and steal millions of dollars from them. And they're saying, hey, but Dom, you had a vuln scan that says I was vulnerable. How did it not get patched? How did it not get dealt with? And I think that's the conversation. A great from Nathan Taylor, if you remember at Machine Logic, he was telling us about how he had started scanning people's websites, right? He had started adding their
Right.
websites into his vulnerability scanner, but he didn't control their websites and he had no
Right.
access to their websites. And the people that
Right.
had access to the websites didn't care. And so you get
Right.
into this world where he knew of a vulnerability and could do nothing about it. And he stopped scanning those sites. Once he stopped getting the ability to have people give him a path forward, they made a choice that it was better not to know those answers. And so it's a
Right.
little counterintuitive. The perfect answer is scan it and fix it. That's the perfect answer.
Right.
Sometimes capitalism doesn't allow for that. So just be careful how you're rolling out vulnerability scanning if you're not prepared
Well,
to
to
do
the
something
same
about it, in my
thing,
opinion.
if we go back to Schmabtech, if you'll recall, it became very big news that Schmabtech is incapable of patching things. So from
Yep.
that point forward, you knew this, right? And now you're culpable because you knew that the
Yep.
tool you're using has been proven to be ineffective by a huge amount of people. You would get torn up in court about that because they'd be like, why are you still using it? Or why aren't you doing something else to verify
Yeah.
it?
Did you just choose profit over that? Are you lazy? Do you not understand the
Right.
risk and culpability? And so
Right.
I think, we're a little off the conversation about why patching is so important and how speedily patching things is so important. When you're talking to customers, how many of you out there as MSPs have had that pushback of, oh, I can't be down. I think to your point, even with the tax accountants, we can't do anything with them till after April. You're not going to patch till
Right.
after April. You're not going to like, come on, this is
Right.
craziness. But
It's a change
um,
freeze.
you,
That's the word I hear all the time. Change freeze.
it's a change freeze. I remember that term. Yeah, 100%. We're not letting anything change till after tax season. Well, great.
Right.
Unfortunately, the threat actors decided they want that money and they don't care about that.
And it's tax
I-
returns, like everything you need to know about someone to steal their identity in one document.
It's one of my favorite
Yeah.
places. Perhaps I've said too much, but yeah, no tax and accounting firms. They're funny about that. But I think this is one of those where if I was giving advice to my friends starting an MSP today, I would make patching one of those things that are inalienable. It's going to happen. It's going to happen fast. It is definitely going to interrupt business if it has to, and we have no defensibility not patching. So when Microsoft hits this one on the nose, it is probably the first thing you ever do when you're enumerating a target. When you get past the OSINT part of digging in and trying to find some data about the target that you're after, you then get into that enumeration phase. And the enumeration phase, for anybody that's not doing this, is to go dig up and document the assets and the endpoints. I have a 443 open on this server. I have 80 open on this server. I have 53 open on the server. And then you start digging in with either NSE scripts or other methodologies. What's vulnerable? What can I attack? And so when you go, why would I patch? Because you're literally in that cat and mouse game, and it's like you saying, I'm not going to close any of those vulnerabilities, and I'm going to give Matt 1,000 things to dig through that are vulnerable, that can
And
be
keep
used
in mind
against me.
too,
And
when you're
so,
doing that discovery, you're going to see this port 80 is open, which I hope it's not because it should be HTTPS. Let's say port 80 is open. It's going to
Yeah.
say, like, if you're using Apache, by default, it's going to say Apache and the exact version number
it's
in the
very
header,
handy.
right? It's going to, and then all you have to do is literally, well, actually, you can do it in the command line. But if you're using a browser, you just copy paste that in exploit DB, and it's like, oh, do this. Here's 17 different scripts to try to exploit that.
Yeah. And sometimes it's out of our control. You kind of just triggered me on something, Dom. So one of the challenges I had with patching was I turned on a device health posture, saying you must be in the right version of Chrome, you must be up to date, your phone can't be rooted, all those basic concepts. And the interesting part about it was I kept getting failed logins from one of my primary PSA tools. And I was like, why is it causing these people to fail the login for health check? I go on to realize that they were using Chrome 57 binaries in the accounting package connector in the PSA to connect into my authentication front end to go through my conditional access, and the conditional access was failing it, saying you're out of date in Chrome. Their Chrome browser was up to date, but the vendor baked in things that could not be patched by you.
Right.
as an attack surface into their tool. So take it with a grain of salt that this is much more about defensibility and doing all the things you can do to patch. And oftentimes these things are somewhat endemically supply chain risks that are based on the technology being provided to us. And, you know, Jason Slagle picks people
Log4j is
apart
probably the
all the
best
time.
example of that in the last few
Yeah.
years, right? So many things, anything with Java, which is a lot, was vulnerable to that, right? So, and when like, it's hard if you bought a packaged application that had Log4j in it. Minecraft, or was it Minecraft? Yeah, Minecraft was a great
Minecraft had
example of
Log4j.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that client is there. Like until Microsoft does all the work to pull in the new Log4j, write it into their code, fix any regression that caused, and push an update, you're stuck with it.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. So I think we beat patching to death. I think it needs to be beaten to death. It's also one of those things that you can start seeing get easier and easier as more people go towards SaaS applications, as more, or at least not easier, but certainly in different purviews of who's responsible for it to some extent.
Right.
But you see the SaaS applications changing that. You see me going towards just using a native OS without any local line of business software that's you know, infrastructural or installed, right? No install base.
Right.
Well, then I start dropping it down to I need to update my operating system. I need to update Chrome. I need to update some of the third parties that I do still have. But you see that surface area dropping considerably, and you can make it more built into the process. Like you cannot even sign into Microsoft unless your patching has been done in X days.
Right.
And so you start making it where it's harder for people to do the wrong, you know, back to that old adage, and easier to do
Right.
the right around patching. So
Right.
what's our next piece that we want to kick around? Microsoft gave us a beautiful bell curve to mess with. So what's the next
Data
one? We've got
protection.
anti-malware and data protection. What do you want to go first?
Stack anti-malware. I feel like we'll get on some rabbit holes about data protection.
And there certainly won't be any on anti-malware, I'm sure.
Well,
So
you
we're
know.
talking about, yeah, we're talking about anti-malware, and Microsoft calls it anti-malware. CIS puts it as control number 10. Control 10 speaks towards the places you might need anti-malware, the types of anti-malware, things that you have there. But this is probably one of the ones where I think MSPs get it right and also fail it at the same exact time, right? In the sense that MSPs have always included some type of antivirus or malware agent for at least as long as I remember being an MSP, right? You either had WebRoot and it was packaged with something, or you then put in Sophos, or it's always been part of our offering, right? We've always considered it as part of that core security product. So I think the concept of anti-malware is pretty well entrenched in MSP's brain in the way that functions. What I think is the biggest gap and the biggest shift is the understanding of what they're seeing. And what I mean by that, Dom, is like, let's say SentinelOne detects that there was a malicious payload stopped, and then it detects it again, and then it detects it again.
Right.
There's a lot of services out there that go, cool, SentinelOne's doing its job, stopping it. But what they don't realize is I'm literally just sitting there on the keyboard hammering away at SentinelOne until I find the one that doesn't alert and that does
Right.
get past their capabilities, right? And undermines its capabilities. So what are your thoughts around how MSPs can better that detection and understanding? Do they build it in-house? Do they partner with someone? Like, how do you make anti-malware effective, not just present, but effective?
My advocation is always going to be partner with someone, unless you want to invest serious money to stand up a true SOC and analyst practice and have an IR team, which I do mean serious money, millions. It's not going to be worth it for you, right? When there are vendors out there who do an excellent job at this, and will put you much further than you probably are today. But the biggest thing, like if you're just starting, let's say you have SentinelOne deployed to 1,000 endpoints. Anytime SentinelOne flags you about something, at least dig into it a little bit. Understand what did it stop. See if you can understand how did it come from a USB, back to our earlier conversation. Did it come from an email? Whatever it may have come from, and start to understand how someone's trying to get in. Because if it's gotten to the endpoint, it's probably defeated a couple layers, right? Whether that's the human layer of if they plugged something in they shouldn't have, whether that's it got through your email security, right? Whatever it was, right? Something has already occurred that's akin to an incident because it's beat something, right? Don't know what it is, but it's beat something if SentinelOne's yelling at you about it. So dig into that. And definitely on number 2, understand that there's probably some level of persistent access that I can keep beating it until I beat it, right? And I think that's probably the biggest point is twice is not a coincidence, right? Once could literally be a drive-by and we saved the user from a bad link, hurrah. You could determine that. That's great. The second time, it didn't happen twice. right? So you have to dig in and really understand why. And that's where a vendor or a tool that's looking at things holistically, that's looking at email and endpoint and network and everything, be like, wait a minute, this payload came to 7 people or whatever happened. And you could start to take some affirmative action instead of, like you said, just being like, yeah, good job, Sentinel-1 or whatever. I'm not picking on
Yeah.
Sentinel-1, by the way, any of them.
Yeah, they could be input any name. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other part of this is that when we think about malware, we only think about it at the endpoint. We don't think about the other prescriptive aspects to your statement of it probably got through something else. It probably already made it through. And so you have to think about, are those layers of malware prevention growing, and are they iterative, and are they layered? And I know the layered onion of cybersecurity, the Swiss cheese model of cybersecurity, or some earlier pushes at this, but their intention is to say, we can't just depend on one thing to succeed or fail, right? If we go back to my football analogy about defenses, right, in this conversation, we have a primary point, which is our defensive line. We have a secondary, right, which is our linebackers. We have a corner, and we have a safety. We don't go, you know what? I'm just going to do malware at the line. I don't care about those safeties or the corners or the. That's not how this works. You've got to approach it in every layer that it might be possible to approach it, if based on the threat, and that would be things like having malware protection inside your email, having link scanning that does that detonates it somewhere in a sandbox, having reputation-enabled defense and capabilities around the delivery of things, having some things that actually triage and can pull back and claw back malware once it's discovered. We always think of malware in the protection phase. And to bring everybody back to CIS, you have identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And we focus so much on protection because that's what Superman does. Superman saves you from injury. There's not been many times when Superman rescues the girl and she's missing an arm, right? Like it's all about 100% or nothing protection. There is no loss, right? And I think the point is that we think about it from a Superman perspective. But if you've ever lived in the casualties of war and battlefield or in fighting sports, you run into an understanding that there's always casualty, right? And there's always that. And so you have to think about, I want to be able to detect. So some of the things when we talk about malware defenses aren't simply protection. Like think about our email thing. Let's say we know that malware got through and Sentinel-1 was popped, and we're seeing it pop up over and over again. We're doing our triage and we find out it got through the spam filter. If you don't have detection and response capacitances to detect and actually determine if this is an anomaly, where did it come from? How did I get this? But then also to respond and say, hey, can I claw back 12 of those emails because only one of them has been clicked on so far? And let's get rid of these other 11 and let's pull it back. That's a malware defense, right? It's an operational incident response defense, but it is a malware defense in the ability to respond to detect, and to prevent the actions of malicious operations and malicious
and it's
tools.
a documentable incident. You need to be documenting that you did these things, right? Not the logs in whatever email security platform with cyber immunity. I mean, like writing down in whatever form or fashion makes sense for your business. We checked out this. We found out through this method that it came this way. We did this in response, and then save that. That's your defensibility right there. Like taking the action is huge, but you didn't do it if you didn't write it down.
I love that we added this component to the bell curve. Maybe this is like the star on the outside of the bell curve, comma space, it must be written down. But I do believe that's actually such a good call out. We should dwell on it for a minute. I asked a question today in an M&A panel that I was at of how many of them thought they had a very good incident response capability for both themselves and for their clients. Documentation, the full closure, the flow, what happened, authoring history. There was nobody that raised their hand, not a single person. And so you get into this understanding that all of these things Microsoft's talking about are valuable for doing the protection and the detection and the actual tactical, technical aspect of this. But if you don't author history, if you don't write what happened and talk about the way your mind was thinking as you made this decision, what was the things that you made as part of your, it's very hard to prove reasonableness. I think it becomes very hard to prove what actually happened other than just the telemetry. Well, guess what? The telemetry says you failed. How do you have this conversation in a way that says, oh, found this was a weakness. And then if you're really a rock star, you have an after action review. And you take that information that you've garnered and you fix it and you add new controls or you modify the controls. You see, how did they fail? What got by it? What was I missing? Is it because Iron Scales is doing the job or is it not? Am I needing to move to an Avalon or do I need to, and you get into these kind of world where that incident response should be the layer at which you kind of look back at these things and determine if your skills are where they should be, and if your capabilities are invested.
And
where
also
they should
share that intelligence, right? Like obviously in a redacted format, but share that intelligence. If your email security vendor missed something and you do your incident response and you're like, oh, it came through and it snuck through Schmooze Point and I found it here. Go call Schmooze Point and be like, hey, you guys missed this. I wanted to get this sample over to you. They can add that back to their engine, right?
Yep.
And then every single Schmooze Point customer benefits from it. So that's a big one too. That's obviously probably a little bit more on the advanced side. It takes time to work that into a habit, but it's so powerful because now you're helping the entire community of people using whatever product may have had a miss, and every product will have a miss.
So it's another, Dom, you're at 50 points. I only have like 0, but it's another one of those points is that if you look at your tool set, you'll start finding which ones enable me to do this the most. If you look at a product like Avanon and the way they approach it through Checkpoint, when the data is there, it's automatically being added to the pool. It's being added to those things. As you say, this was actually bad, and you told me it was good. They update their machine learning indexes. They update their backend data automatically. And so you see this. It doesn't always have to be this massive orchestration. Sometimes it can be better tools. I make all these jokes all the time about how, it's not the scalpel, it's the surgeon. It's not, it's that kind of conversation. This is also a case where, but if that surgeon only had to poke their thumb through your belly, it's not going to be as efficacious as a scalpel. And so it does kind of get into having better tools matters too. But
well, like imagine he bought a scalpel on Wish, right? It would not go well.
It would be the best.
You have to think about these things. And to your point, like I mean, there are vendors that you probably will have to call if you really want to get a hold of them, which would suck.
Yeah.
But they exist. But a lot of these companies, Microsoft is fantastic at this, saying submit this to Microsoft for us to review it and add it to the security graph, right? Same concept. A lot of vendors are catching up with that. Some aren't there yet, but I think the intent is there, to where you just say this was bad. And to the same point, like you're going to deal with false positive. You could also say this was good, and they'll review it and figure out why they thought it was bad. So it's a two-way street, but so many people don't share that intelligence, right? And then they've done nothing. And not only that same tool, if you don't move off of it, is going to miss the same payload tomorrow. So also bear that in mind. You're helping yourself just as much as you're helping everyone else.
Cool add-on to that is you actually just brought up a concept we can teach. So there is a concept called crossover error rate. That is a term you need to understand in cybersecurity. Crossover error rate is the mix between where the false positive and the false negative meet, right? Where that happy, how many false positives versus how many false negatives, it guides that middle point. And so crossover error rate is a term used for a lot of different things in that space, but just figure we'd do a little nomenclature education here. But that's what you're describing when you're talking about, this false negative rate and where those meet and what that does to security, right? Because if you get lots of false negatives, you end up marking something positive or you let something through that shouldn't have been, and then vice versa on the false positives. You actually waste someone's business time by them not receiving the email that was actually just poorly crafted or potentially met a machine learning indice of some sort. But so where else can we think of malware defenses? Dom, we talked about email. We talked about endpoint. Where else do we see malware type operations starting to exist, malware prevention starting to exist?
Oh man, in documents, that's the new hotness. And I don't mean old school macros, like use attack surface reduction, block macros. Like if your client really needs them, sucks, you're gonna have to start monitoring them. But like turn that crap off if you can. But we're really talking about pushing payloads through links in documents. Remember when link rewriting came out and it was this new hotness, and it was like, oh, we're gonna change the link in email, we're gonna scan it on demand. Beautiful. Well, threat actors are smart and they're like, oh man, scanning links in my email. I'm gonna put it in a Word doc that looks like an important business letter.
Yep.
And then they're gonna click it in there and it's gonna skip all that. Well, vendors have caught up. Avanon does a fantastic job of this. Microsoft does a fantastic job of this, and I'm sure others. Where in the document, and now in the document, whether it's in SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, your email, whatever, Slack if you're using fat clients, when you click that link, it now gets evaluated, right? It will cause a slowdown of a second or two.
It's like a just-in-time link click, right? Is what they're starting to do, yeah.
Right. So that's a big one because now I can push that to a really smart payload if I've written one that could get around whatever endpoint you're running. So it's just another layer you can sneak in there that blocks, I actually literally on my personal email just got another one today from a different sender that was email doesn't, I mean, it looks very suspicious to me, but to a lot of people, it's going to look like a legit email. You're going to open the document. And I pulled up the link in a burner box, and it was a smart payload. That burner box is now burned. So it's,
fair.
You've got to think of, I don't know, I always try to look back and how would I punch me, right? If I was looking at my defenses, where would I attack? Where's the mushiness? It's somewhere. So documents is big, endpoints is big, mobile devices are huge.
Yep,
right?
that was the next
I'm
one I
an
was going
Android
with.
user. I love Android, but man, our store kind of sucks sometimes. But honestly, and I've actually been teaching this to my kids, of stop installing junk, right? Like just don't. You like there's a calculator built in. You don't need the pink calculator. Use built in. You know what I mean? It's those different.
But the pink one's so nice, Dom. I want the colors. Like it's my
the
color.
Russian purple calculator. Yeah.
Yeah. I was weird that they called it a Russian purple calculator, but maybe I was just naive.
Maybe it was a little targeted.
It might have been dedicated to me. Yes, definitely.
But it's mobile devices are all about common practice, in my opinion. Now the average end user is going to be like, that app solves a problem for me. Click. Mobile anti-malware is a real thing now. It does. I actually run Defender on my, I pay for a subscription, and I have Defender on my personal device. And it hasn't found anything because I don't download ridiculous apps, but hopefully it would. But also,
you
if you
test
own the
it out?
device, I don't. No, I
Okay.
appreciate
just
that.
Asking.
Yeah.
I'm a giver. That's what I do.
Yeah.
No.
I don't know.
And
What
I think
else?
that's the point. Yeah, no, I was going to add in, it's really just about bringing malware protections to where users' fingerprints land, right? And that comes back to Phyllis Lee's kind of conversation of, where does your network end? Well, where a user's fingerprints land. And so another unaddressed piece we haven't talked about is malware delivery and inspection at the network layer, right? And finding those type of things as it flies over the firewalls and over those things. And a very effective way to solve that is by approaching it from a SASE or secure access service edge as a methodology of doing that. And the reason for that is that SASE edge allows you to bring all of the traffic to be inspected and de-encrypted potentially based on your settings at one central point. And so wherever my user's fingertips are, if I set up a SASE edge to say I can only sign in from behind this SASE edge, then now my fingertips will have to land somewhere where I have purview, right? They will have to land somewhere. If I'm going to get in, the fingers landing there will mean that it's going to be going through an edge, like a total edge, or whoever it may be in that regard that you choose to work with.
Right.
And so malware in its flight state, right? Malware in its in traffic state. There's a really cool new reverse shell that I'm going to be testing out that is it buries the traffic in random HTTPS traffic to the C² server. And so it does a really good job of just looking like normal web traffic, right? To the C², command and control. Sorry. Just wanted to give my C. I haven't done that acronym yet. But the C² services, those command and control, it does it all through hidden HTTPS. And so that means it's encrypted, which means if you were even going to have a chance at finding the pattern of that C² traffic in there, you'd have to disencrypt it. And so I think when we start talking about malware defenses, people just go straight to an endpoint agent. That's their brain. But there's so many different parts of where you should be treating for and looking for malware, right? We've already covered.
Don't forget the
4 or 5
endpoint agent.
True story.
We're not discounting that piece of the puzzle. I started explaining SASE in a different way. I don't know if this will help for you, but when people ask me about it, it's the UTM, like the whole fancy sonic wall. Well, maybe not sonic wall. The whole fancy device you had that was capable of doing the decryption and the IPS. That's in the cloud. So no matter where the user is, it works. And it's helped me explain things a little easier. So I don't know if that'll help you.
Albert Einstein says it's the brilliant person that can make extremely complex topics sound simple. I've gone the other path, so I'm apparently the dumbest person here, right? But no, you're right. Explaining it in that way makes people easy to grab that ledge on that conversation.
And it's we've lost that walled garden, and
we have.
Aside from malware protection, slight segue, and we only have a few minutes for data protection, but there's a lot of other benefits to SASE too, right? It's the encapsulation on the Starbucks network, or from the toaster that's in your end user's house that toasts on the app and is now pinging DNS and taking them down. Whatever it is, like that protection, you're taking the corporate network literally anywhere the user is, and that's extremely powerful, right? It means all the traffic coming off of that machine is encrypted, and it doesn't split tunnels depending on your provider.
How
It
you've
doesn't split
configured.
tunnels until it's in that environment, that secured environment, where maybe if you look at some of the newer ones, you can even tie that back to your on-prem VPN or VPN in Azure or whatever. So you also start to get to manipulate the traffic in the cloud as to where it's going to go. And you made a really good point this morning. You were using a SASE product, and you actually got reduced latency when you were on the SASE product, and that's because that particular vendor is the biggest in the world with a network, right? Which I probably just gave them away. So it's Cloudflare, but
it's
the
Cloudflare,
biggest network on the planet. And they also have the best routing tools on the planet. But the point is when you're connected to a SASE edge, a good one, and Cloudflare's not the only one they can do this. They're now route optimizing your traffic, and they're reducing that latency, and your Teams calls work better. So SASE is something I strongly advocate for, especially in a world where that firewall you just bought a couple of years ago might be useless if that customer is not fully back in the office.
To take this to its next segue, you kind of gave me this. Another thing that SASE or zero trust components like this do is they make it much easier to handle data loss prevention. So let's talk about data protections, Dom. So let's get kicked off into Microsoft's last piece of this bell curve. We've so far covered MFA, we've covered Antimalware, we've covered a bunch of these pieces, but let's get into data protection. Dom, what is your thoughts initially to open this salvo up around data protection?
First thing you got to know about your data. I think every customer I ever onboarded in my MSP, not all of them, a lot of them were like, well, we don't collect a lot of sensitive data. And sure enough, it's like, oh, here's my note to charge Sally's Visa. And it's because the payment website was down. So they wrote it in a notepad and put it on the P drive or whatever, right? So knowing what data you have, which honestly for me always started with asking questions, but then also starts with using some sort of tool to examine the different storage mediums and understand what kind of data is there.
Yeah. You can't protect what you don't know you don't have, right? And I think that's the challenge of, as a industry in general, we collect a lot of data and never think about its sensitivity. But we don't own that data, right? Oftentimes we are borrowing that data from someone. And those privacy legislations that are out there, there's 20 some odd in every different state, 24 or so states trying to pass privacy legislation. It's all speaking towards that data and its sensitivity. So when Microsoft says data protections or put in data protections, and that's one of the bell curve, it's because that's the root and the heart of cybersecurity. Not just pull my chain here, but cybersecurity is about data, period. Right? It's the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability of space data. So the point is that data protections take it to the actual real merit. And I think these are some of the more pragmatic pieces, but also the most esoteric to define. What is data protections? Right. And so you get into that conversation, but it starts with a couple of key concepts. The first one I would bring up is data loss prevention. What data loss prevention is it's this concept that there's certain formats of data that I know to always be that format. If I have 123-45-6789, pretty certain that's a social security number, right? And so you get these patternistic aspects of saying, why don't we set some rules that even if someone's compromised, let's say my friend DomKirby is compromised. DomKirby wants to send, as a threat actor, out all this data that he's gathered, right? And so these social security numbers, these sensitive data points, these documents, data loss prevention attempts to block that transport as soon as it detects that data. And you can set what's called clipping rules, right? A clipping rule is essentially this conversation of how many can happen before I'm not okay with this. Like if Dom is used to sending one social to people every day for his HR manager or hiring or something to that effect, then it would be normal for him to do 2 or 1. But 20 is not going to be normal. And so you can define these kind of barriers of where data protection exists, and the clipping level, quote unquote, is a concept used quite a bit in cybersecurity as well.
And it's come
but what else can we...
I remember using a particular tool back in the day to scan file shares, and any 16-digit number was suddenly a credit card number. Right. And it's garbage. Like the reports were a complete joke. But I digress. Now modern ones know that visas start with 4 and they meet certain patterns, and Amexes start this way, and social security numbers fit within these ranges, and they can make intelligent decisions about that. And you can build them yourself, right? And run your own sort of process and procedure. Maybe you have code words for projects in a company and they're protecting trade secrets, and Project Orion or whatever, right, gets flagged. You can make a lot of cool decisions. And it's, I remember a time when DLP was like, don't let that happen. Now you can be like, let that happen, but apply this classification, which we'll get to in a
Yep.
second, or
That's what we're hitting
encrypt it,
next.
or do
Yep.
something. So, speaking of classification, that's
Just
a
go
big
right
one.
in
And
it.
we're not talking about Bell LaPadula, which I guess
Yeah.
I suppose you could use Bell LaPadula if that is
Yeah.
your style. Bell LaPadula is the theory that
Secret,
DoD
top
builds on
secret.
to secret,
Yeah,
top
yeah.
secret, SCI, and now we in the States have blown this
No
up to 4
read,
million
no read
categories.
up, no write down, right? The kind of restrictions on how data is handled in
Yeah.
that regard.
Yeah.
So,
But anyways, classification is tagging your data as what is this data? You're classifying it as what, right? And
Yeah.
it could be simple. It could be this is confidential and this is highly confidential. This is
Yeah.
finance confidential. That's the easiest way to go about it, in my opinion. Right? You don't have
Yeah.
top secret in most companies. You have confidential and then
so
really confidential.
So the intention of that is to try to have some systemic way to stop the data from being taken, right? It's looking at it and
Right.
saying it can't be taken, whether it be sensitivity labels, or whether it be data that's been discovered through machine learning. But the other side of this is making the data itself not usable. And so that brings us to another concept of data protection that I like to call cryptographic shredding. And it's this term that says, if I have a private and public key pair to decrypt this, and I only hold this private key, then if I lose that data, I can shred this key and the data is not manipulable. It's not usable. It's useless, right? It's
Right.
encrypted. And so the conversation is that when you're talking about data protections, we also need to consider encryption. Encryption is a form of
Yep.
data protections in the sense that you could say, if this email, if this document, if this picture, if this Adobe has a tag that says this is Project Deschutes, which I'm calling back to a Microsoft project that I was part of that they
Yeah.
said they'd sue if we talked about back then. If it's part of Project Deschutes, then always encrypt it. And that way, if it is
Right.
ever stolen or it is ever egressed, it's egressed in its encrypted fashion. And it can only be
Right.
read by that private key. And so you get back to this world of saying, think about data protection in layers. Try not to lose it, but if I lose it, how can I protect it? And this is actually just a common concept in cybersecurity, period, is trying to think about things in their iterative layer-based approaches to the need of the data that you're protecting. If I'm just sending
Right.
Dom my weekly love note, which I try not to tell people about, and I may have said too much, then I don't know that it needs to be encrypted. But if I am sending sensitive
No,
data
those go
about
in
Pax8's
Signal every time.
Thank you. They should. They should. But the point is that data loss and data protections are kind of a broad topic. We could get into them for hours and hours and hours. But in general, it's really about trying to keep it from leaving, classifying it properly ahead of time, placing appropriate protections on it, and encrypting it so you can protect it if it is stolen. And those are some of the core
But
concepts
at
in
the
that.
risk of putting us over time, I will say on the point of encryption, you can apply it broadly, and you should apply it broadly in some cases. In that case, is endpoints. Encrypt every computer. Like that is
Amen.
if I'm going to
Preach
give
it.
you one call to action, encrypt every single. And if it can't be encrypted, get rid of it and buy one that can be encrypted. Because that's the simplest protection you could possibly do. Is that one file? We've seen so many HIPAA cases in a myriad of places where it's just that one laptop got stolen out of someone's car, and there was some export of
The $1
patient
million
names or whatever.
laptop was one of those
Yeah,
terms, actually.
exactly. Encrypt endpoints, phones, laptops, all of it. Even desktops. I'm going to tell you to encrypt desktops because someone could break in and snatch a desktop, and now you've got a HIPAA breach.
Well, Claire's about to
just
give us the
nits in the
hook,
heart.
so
All
I'm
right.
pretty certain we need to roll on.
So I think we got
had
one
a
more thing
really-
to do before we sign off.
Yep.
Right.
Well, we got two more things to do. No, we're good. So the first
okay.
thing is we had a really awesome event last week, and our amazing live studios team has put together a cool video about our security boot camp. Can we go ahead and roll to that, Danielle? I was about to cut you off too early. I'm gonna get in trouble.
I want to share just a couple of facts with you from 2022 so far. FBI has identified 2,000 plus ransomware attacks between January and July. 20% of organizations have experienced ransomware attacks. 1,211 ransomware variants were created each day. That's according to SonicWall. 95% of data breaches can be traced back to human error. Average cost of a breach due to ransomware is now up to $4.3 million.
We have to be better. We all have to be better. We have to be humble. We have to be transparent. We have to be better at security. I hope you don't walk away and do nothing. One of the biggest challenges out of every single one of these conferences that I went to is I walked away with the nugget that would have stopped me from losing the next time, and I lost anyway. Don't be that person.
Pax8 has enabled my business to grow, so fast, compared to the way we were before. It's just unbelievable the support we get, and having the whole team, at your side.
We're going to hit you with a lot of knowledge in a small amount of time. Please do take notes. If you got your trial tenant created, please work with the team as we're building a new CA policy or whatever, because the goal is for you to take this away and take a bit of a stack away that you can build on.
I think when you're so busy working in the business, to come to one of these things, you can take a deep breath, relax, and then have people tell me, oh, this is what I need to do, make it easy. So that's what Pax8 does for me. It makes it easy.
Understand your wants and needs, try to bring those back to us so that we can try to keep moving in a way that supports you well. And that's kind of where we are.
It was a really fun event. Definitely the best weekend
Yeah, it
we've
was a
ever put on.
blast. Yeah, for sure. Dom, on that note, and us being late, let's close this out. I believe you have a call to action for everybody out of today's conversation.
Yeah. So if you're watching this on YouTube, click all the buttons below. If the subscribe button's red, that's the wrong color. Click it, subscribe, click the bell. We want to see you every week. And as I understand it, there's some new shows getting ready to come out on Pax8 Live from some good friends of ours, and I'm super excited to see them. I haven't even gotten a sneak peek at them. I'm a little sad about that. I feel like I should be an insider. But it is what it is. Do the subscribe thing. If you're not watching this on YouTube, somebody's pirating this, please let us know. You should definitely be watching this on YouTube.
That's a fair call out.
Yeah. Should only be on YouTube. With that,
I'm going to add one more thing too, because what I want you to do out of this is my challenge is if you are not validating your patching, if you are simply just patching and calling it good, and I actually want to call out Positive Energy. This event inspired them to set a password on their desktop. I'm not sure that was the barrier we wanted you to reach, but I'm good with the escalatory nature. But next week, we're going to go over, if you're not patching, add a vulnerability management service. Use a Qualys, use a Nessus, use a Cyber CNS, use something like that to help validate whether or not your patching is functioning. Next week's show, though, is going to be really awesome. We're bringing on Jason Slagle, and we're going to get down and dirty on what does it take as an MSP? What do you have to have? What sword, what shield, what trench digging tool, what do you have to have in order to be able to protect your client? What do you need? What are those core pieces? What has to be in your stack? And what do you just absolutely say, I'm not doing that, client? So next week should be a really fun show with Jason Slagle. Join us then. We'd love it. So that's it. Without further ado, close us out. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, and I'll see y'all next week.